in order to get to a finish line. These projects are 2, 3, 5, some of them, are maybe a decade long. How do I make sure that I meet that deadline to deliver something to my customer? Same with you guys. You guys are building a very complicated system, and you have to meet a deadline. You have to have your car ready to race when you get here in July, right? And we see teams come to the race, and they're still trying to put their car together, and that just puts a lot of stress in your life. What if we can plan out the project, understand when you're on track and when you're off track, what can we do to recover? So I want to give you some tips on that. Of course, as with everything, I want to start out with a quote. The quote is this: all things are created twice, first mentally, then physically. The key to creativity is to begin with the end in mind, with a vision and a blueprint of the desired result. And I brought this quote up because really, if you try to design a solar car by just putting something together and then adding onto it and then adding onto it and then adding onto it after that, the pieces don't come together. Imagine you set up different teams of people and you say, okay, I'm going to build a frame. These guys are going to do suspension. These guys are going to do electrical. And you didn't plan things out. You just said, okay, you're responsible. You go do it. You go design. And then you go design. When all the pieces are done, they may all look beautiful, but it's not going to integrate together. And so really, the very first thing that happens in a solar car team typically is you sit down as a team. You start visualizing what does the car look like? What are the components that need to get in the car? Typically in our teams, and I've been part of a team as a student, I've been part of several different teams as an advisor, we don't start building until, late October, November. We spend the first few months of the team just sitting down together, thinking about what the car's going to look like. Think about what parts that we want to put in the car, and then piecing a frame around the parts. If you try to put a frame design together first, and then you start putting the parts in it, it's never going to come back together. So, anyway, solar car teams, we basically act in a multidisciplinary team. So, I don't know how many teams have been here for a while or how many teams are new, but the very first thing in organizing a team is to start splitting yourself into smaller teams. If you have one big team and everyone does everything, it's kind of unwieldy in a sense. Especially if you have teams of 8 to 10 to 12 to 15 or even more than that, you just can't work in an ad hoc way. You want to start dividing your team up and say, hey, this group of people will be responsible for the mechanical design. This group of people will be responsible for the electrical design. This group of people may be in charge of the power system, the array inputs. This group of people might be in charge of the business aspects and fundraising and getting your name out there. So you want to start dividing your team into different sub-teams. And what that does is it gives you a way to focus certain team members, but it also invests responsibility to more than just the captain, right? If you have a team that says, I've got a captain and then I've got all the other team members, then the captain really has to do everything. And that's really hard because there's so many things to do in a solar car project that if you invest the responsibility solely on the captain and not have sub-team leads, the captain will not be able to keep everything together. So divide yourselves into sub-teams. Solar car projects take a long time. So at Walnut, we have built cars in a year before. I say that, however, having many, many years of experience putting it together. And so a lot of the questions that we've had have already been answered, and we just try, okay, I just want to modify this design a little bit and tweak it a little bit and optimize here. If you're starting from scratch, you're going to have to spend some time researching, trying to find out information, starting to build stuff, and then failing, and then restarting. So it's going to take a period of time. How do we make sure that we don't run out of time as we build it? And it requires development of new skills. When we think about project management, you may say, normally it takes, a few weeks to build a frame together, to weld it up. Well, you also have to think about the fact that many of you guys may not have the experience to put it together, so you're going to have to learn these skills. So it's going to take more time than you expect. So you have to plan for that. Every task, you need to plan for what happens if something goes wrong, what happens if this doesn't work out. And so you got to leave yourself some time and some space to do that. So how do we do this, right? How do these teams work together? How do we get the project done on time? How do we make sure that we have appropriate, people to teach? So it's all about project management. So the art of project management is just essentially saying, take a bigger piece of something, bigger task, and continue to break it into smaller pieces so that it could be managed and you can actually tell how long it takes to do something. If I were to tell you, hey, how long is it going to take you to build a solar car? What would you tell me? And at what fidelity could you tell me? I can say, I'm going to build a solar car, it's going to take a year to do. Am I going to be a month off? Am I going to be several weeks off? Am I going to be right on the dot? Don't know. Let's break it further. How long is it going to take you to put an array together? You don't necessarily know that either. But how long is it going to take you to fabricate a dashboard with 10 different switches on it? Okay, you could probably tell me that's probably going to be on the order of like a 2-hour job to bend the metal, to drill the holes and install switches, right? So if you're able to break the task down to smaller and smaller pieces, then you have a more realistic idea of how long it's going to take. Now you add all those tasks together, then you can answer the task of the how long does it take to build a solar car? You know how. Okay? It also helps to develop the roadmap for how to get there from here. Again, as you break things into smaller pieces, you know you have certain components in the system, and you know that you have to do certain tasks before other tasks. So typically in a solar car, we say that you've got to put your electric car together first, and then you add solar to your electric car, right? If you had put the array in first, that's great and all, but you can't test it because you have no way of running down the energy, right? You don't know how it's going to run in your car. Instead, if you were to get your batteries together, get a motor and motor controller together, wire them up, and get a pedal to drive the car, you can test an electric car even before you get to the array. You got to plan for that. Flesh out dependencies between teams. So if you've broken your team into sub-teams, you may have certain handoffs between the teams that certain people are dependent on. So, for example, if I were to make a dashboard, let's say the mechanical team is responsible for putting a dashboard together. Okay, well, what's the dependency on making that dashboard? You have to know what goes in the dashboard, which means you have to have the electrical design to say, this is the type of instrumentation I'm going to put in. I'm going to need these switches. These wires go here. And so a mechanical team can fabricate what the dashboard looks like, and the electrical team can put those pieces in. You need to plan for that. Okay? Set trip points for evaluation. As you go along, not everything goes to plan. Certain things go wrong. And you need to know when you're running over time, you need to know if you need to reallocate resources. So, for example, if I allocated, 2 months to build a frame, right? And I start running into 2.5, 3 months into building a frame. And I'm working on an electrical system in parallel, but they're doing okay. You may want to say, hey, I'm going to reallocate some of the electrical team guys to help finish the frame, because otherwise I'm going to start losing, running out of time. And so I'll talk about a method using a Gantt chart about how to track the progress on that and how to set trip points to say, okay, I need to reevaluate the resources I've allocated for this. Okay? And finally, prioritize work on a week-by-week basis. There's a project management concept called the critical path. Essentially, as you lay out your tasks, there will be a set of tasks that are so critical that if the timeline for those tasks slip, it's going to cause the entire project to slip. Compared to, there are certain tasks because of the dependencies in your project that if it slips, but you just eat into some of the leeway that you've built into the schedule. And so we'll talk about that as well. So, okay. For new teams, you probably don't even have necessarily an idea of how long it takes to build a car and what it takes to do that. However, we've provided you that type of resource. I think that resource was outside as you were coming in. There's a project building calendar, right? It tells you all the stuff in this presentation. So if you go outside and grab that piece, we give you a notional timeline for what you're going to do in September, October, and so on in order to get to completion. Okay, so if you don't have experience with building a solar car, at least you have some notional timeline. I will say these places, these pieces of the calendar is so important. You need to allocate time to re-engineer the car, because when you finish building a car and you test it out, you may have issues. Like Jared said earlier, the winning solar car team isn't necessarily the team that has the best car. It's the team that put the most number of miles on their car because they know how the car runs. I will say that we ran into this in my very first year as a solar car team member. We really hung our hat on knowing that we had to re-engineer the car. We finished our car in that time frame, about a March, April time frame, and we ran it on the road. At the time, we had a frame with a fiberglass body, but it was a fiberglass body with a big piece of foam in between to keep it shape. And we ran it, and we could not get the performance we were looking for. It was just, the car was way too heavy. It looked really cool, and I really appreciated, the visuals of it. But we ran it, we tested it, and it didn't quite perform the way we wanted to. So what did we do? We scrapped the entire car. We chopped it up completely, and we started over. Now, I say that we rebuilt a car in 6 weeks, and we did. But we already figured out all the designs and how the electrical system is laid out. You just relocated all the parts into a different frame, and we put it together. If we had not done that, we would have come here to the race, and we would have just, ran very slowly or not very well. Instead, we tested the car, we built it, we retested it, and we raced, and we did decent, and we got second place in that year. And so, leaving time to re-engineer and test is critical in your project management. Okay, so we give you an outline for how to build the car, but you then need to break it down into smaller pieces. And so the way we do it is we break the project up into major systems and subsystems, and then go on from there. Okay, so as I said, we break the project up into a mechanical team, an electrical team. We may have a power or array team, depending on the number of people we have. And of course, we always have a business team. Okay? From there, you break up into major components within those teams. You have your frame, you have suspension, steering, brakes, drivetrain. That's all the mechanical side of things. On the electrical, you have your main propulsion system and your auxiliary system, and you may break that up even further. Of course, you have your power with the batteries and array. And of course, on the business side, you have different fundraising and community events. Okay? So you lay all those out, and then you note the dependencies between your subsystems. You know, it's tough to start designing your steering and actually putting it together without having the suspension, because typically they're sort of connected together. Likewise, you can't really run a motor or controller without the batteries in place, without actually installing them. So you start saying, hey, I've got to start putting batteries in the car, then I'll start putting the motor and controller in the car, and I'll start putting the array in the car, and so on. You start trying to tie these things together. And then you break down the tasks into your solar car and allocate the time to do that. So, you say, I've got to build a frame, a suspension, the steering, your brakes, and how long is it going to take to do each of those and run the dependencies. I will say, however, a lot of people discount the business side of things, but there's big dependencies there from your business to your engineering side. If you have not fundraised enough to buy certain key parts, like your motor or motor controller, by the time you need it, you may have a whole bunch of people ready to work, and they're going to sit there because there's no parts to work with. So don't forget to allocate. It's like, at this time of the year, we need to have this number of dollars, and track how much you're bringing in as you go along. Okay? The other thing is, be aggressive and finish early. Typically, especially in work, you give people a certain amount of time to do a particular task, and they take that amount of time to do it. They'll basically consume all the time you've allocated them. However, if you have a culture in your team where you say, okay, that might be the time that I've allocated for it, let me see if I can beat that time, and sort of make it into a competition, then you can try to bring in your schedule and give yourself more re-engineering and test time. So you want to definitely try to pull the schedule in. If you let the teams do, let each team member do as much, take as much time as they are allocated, you'll forget something, and then they'll start eating into your test time. So really think about that. Okay, and so I've put together for you a notional schedule based off of sort of a higher level and then breaking it down to lower level. So in a typical building schedule where you're building between December and March, you may want to separate out into different major milestones. You may want to have some type of frame or chassis put together that you can hang most of your stuff on in December. Then you want to start by end of January having some type of rolling chassis, something you can push around, you can test the steering, see that you've got a good turning radius, and so on. And then you move on to something you can power. And then at this point, you're essentially saying, I've got an electric car I can drive around and test. And then you may then add your array to that. So if you think about those high-level goals, how do we get there? Well, you got to start breaking it down. What does it mean to build a chassis? You have to have a frame, You have to install a roll cage and a roll bar according to the rules. You have to add your axles and your seats and your suspension, right? All those things will then contribute to having your chassis. From there, you may want to add steering and your wheels, which isn't on this list, your brakes, and so on. So that'll get you to a rolling chassis. Now, you'll notice here that we've also put some dependencies in place. Without knowing where your axle is, you don't really have a place to mount your suspension. And without your suspension, you have, difficulty putting your steering together. Likewise, on your seats, it's difficult to start installing your steering and your steering wheel without knowing where the driver's going to sit, because the steering rod, the steering column, is going to be, positioned where your driver's going to sit. So if you don't have that, then you can install it and then you can change the design later. So we're showing dependencies between different activities. Likewise, in parallel, I have colored in orange a set of electrical tasks, and that'll show you the dependencies there, and then your power team. And so you can start thinking about laying out your different tasks and your dependencies. Now, the dependencies are key because let's say I had a hard time putting together the front and rear axles, and I start shifting that schedule to the right. When I do that, all of the things that I'm dependent on also need to shift to the right. Because I haven't changed the laws of physics, I am dependent on having the axle in order to do the suspension. So if my axle fabrication starts moving to the right, your suspension starts moving to the right, and you start moving these boxes. And then you'll know, if you start looking at the schedule, you start seeing these boxes move to the right, you'll start knowing that I'm starting to run out of time to do the re-engineering and to do the test. So I hope that this gives you an idea of how to use project management to help organize your tasks, at least in a high-level way. Okay? Now, the way we run our solar car team is once we have those things, that's not sufficient to help you in your day-to-day. What we do, however, is to say, okay, our concept is to, we're going to work, let's say, in this week on the axle, suspension, seats, and electrical design. Okay, when we do that, we then need to say, what are those individual tasks? And we break those up. So if I were to break up the component of steering, well, what do I need to do? I need to find out where am I going to put the steering wheel in the column, where am I going to put the rack and pinion, I'm going to put the wheels together, I got to install the rack and pinion, I got to fabricate steering rods, and I got to put the mounts on. You start breaking things down into smaller and smaller pieces. And then you can give those tasks to individual students or a set of students to go do. And so now those tasks are owned by that student and they're responsible for it. So it's not like one person has to do everything. It's not like the mechanical team captain has to do all of the steering and suspension and all that stuff. You get your team to help you out, but they have to own each of the individual tasks, which means you have to break down your tasks into smaller pieces to do that. So even at this level, determining location of the steering wheel and column, installing the front wheels, installing the rack and pinion, that may be too high of a level. Sometimes we even break down further and say, okay, if I'm installing the rack and pinion, it means I have to put a bracket to install the rack and pinion, drill the holes to mount it, and then actually go and mount it to both on the car and to the kingpins, right? So these are the things that you need to break down, and the way we do it, the way we did it at Walnut is we had a whiteboard on the wall of our garage. And at the very beginning of a work session, we would write down all the bigger tasks and then each individual smaller task, and we would assign people to it. And so everyone knows to go to the board, they would go do their thing, and then they would have the pleasure of crossing the task out when they were done. And that brings some joy to say, yes, I finished something. And then they can pull the next task off the list and go do that, and so on and so on. And by the end of the day, you can go look at your board and see how many cross-outs you have, how many tasks you have to sort of carry over to the next work session, and so on. So we had fun doing that. But the other thing, as you heard in the way we do things, we want to break the task down into something that's achievable in a workday, right? If you've got a big task, let's say, wire up the entire car, it's going to take more than one workday to do it. So let's start breaking it down and say, today, I want to accomplish the wiring between the motor and motor controller. Or today, I want to hook up the wiring from the batteries to the motor controller. And so by the time you get to the end of the day, you can cross out that task and say, I've done something, right? Otherwise, you sort of start getting discouraged, like, I spent all this time working on something, and what did we accomplish? Here you can get a sense of what you've done. Okay? So I put together a typical workday and what our whiteboard looks like on that workday. So at the time, we were working on two different cars. We had an electric solar car, and we had an advanced division car. Okay? And so we said that on a workday with about 16 kids split across the two teams, we were going to fabricate the steering tie rods, fix the rear suspension because we had a problem with it, install the throttle pedal return spring. That's a pretty small task, but it needed to get done, so we want to write it down. Paint the steering column and mount it, install the chain, mount the instrument panel, install the front frame bulkhead, rivet certain things, make the wiring schematic, and so on. You can see the level of detail that we ask the kids to do, and then they can, when they're done, cross it out. But you can tell it sort of spans the amount of time. Making the wiring schematic is going to take some time, and it needed to, we need to allocate a person dedicated to that for the entire day. Whereas installing the throttle return spring, basically the spring that brings your pedal back to zero, that really ought to take 15 minutes. If it took anything more than that, they probably ran into issues. So you know how to allocate time. I would say, however, we plan our project based on higher macro level stuff to keep track of are we on schedule or not. These tasks are just listed. I don't write down and plan out, this takes 15 minutes, that takes half an hour. That level of detail might be too much for you. And you're going to take more time planning that out than you would actually be doing the work. So just have a list of tasks at this point, get the kids to try to do it as fast as they can in a quality way, and then have them check it off, and they're done. Okay? So, of course, in the ideal world, all the tasks will just take the amount of time you allocated for it, and it's done. That never happens. I don't know if you guys have worked on your regular cars or something like that. You say, "Oh, I'm going to do a simple oil change," or I'm going to bleed the brakes or something like that. You allocate a certain amount of time to do it. I've done oil changes before, 15 minutes, no problem. Okay, so I go and allocate that time. Then one of these times I go, "Oh yeah, I'm going to loosen the bolts and." Gee, that's a different color liquid. Why am I getting a red liquid instead of black liquid? I did this, by the way. I drained my transmission fluid instead of my oil. Oops! That task obviously did not take 15 minutes to do. Take a lot longer now because I have no car to drive to get transmission fluid, so I had to go bug my friend to give me a ride to get the proper transmission fluid, and then actually still do the oil change. Things happen. You gotta account for that. Things will happen in your solar car building. You gotta account for that. So we revise our schedule weekly. It's a living schedule. Okay? So yeah, we have our list of tasks, and we want to accomplish all those tasks in a particular day. But it's not going to happen. Things are going to fall off and we don't finish. Now, having said that, it is also important to have growth tasks, meaning that if you plan to do a certain list of tasks on a particular day, you want to have more tasks than you will accomplish in that day. Why? You may run into a roadblock where you can't work on a piece of the car. You need some tasks to give to those people who now can't work on that thing. They got to work on something else. Or you can actually do better than you planned. There are, solar cars not horrible to the point in which everything goes wrong all the time. Sometimes you surprise yourself and say, hey, I finished that task in 15 minutes rather than an hour. Well, you got to have another task to work on. You don't want people sitting around and say, well, I've got nothing else. You want to keep making progress. So you want to have those type of things. Of course, we already talked about the rest of these things. But challenge your members to complete tasks. This is sort of the culture of the team that I was talking about. Make sure that team members don't think they have all the time in the world to do something. Say, let's race. A lot of times we may purposely tell people, hey, go make this panel, and we'll give them 15 minutes to do it, even though I know in the back of my mind it takes an hour to do. They're going to try to do it in 15 minutes because you gave them 15 minutes. And then, it'll usually take something like half an hour, 45 minutes, because they were given less time to do it. Now, you can't be unreasonable, right? Because, high school students, you probably can think, right? And say, yeah, that you're just blowing smoke. So be reasonable, but challenge them and tell them you're challenging them. Hey, can you get that done in 15 minutes? Can you get that done in half an hour? Okay. So I hope that sort of gives you a glimpse of how we run the team in terms of a project management thing, how you plan your tasks out. I have certain project files and things like that that'll help sort of give you an idea of the type of tasks we do. If you want to come up and talk with me afterwards, I can give you that information. But, every car is different. And your designs will be different, so that probably won't necessarily help you too much. But as you plan and as you build now, start thinking about the end, and think about how do you get everything complete. Start breaking them down into smaller and smaller pieces until you can estimate the time that it takes to do it, and then track this along the way. And if you learn to do that in solar car, I bet you will succeed in your career as well, because I use this type of thing every day. Chris is mired in that every day. All of us who work as a career for a living, we have to do this type of planning and project management. Okay? I will say in summary here, proper project management planning identifies your dependencies so you can track where your timeline's going to be. Be ready to modify your schedule. Each and every week you're going to start over, and so when we come to a work session, that's our planning at the very beginning. And budget your schedule for contingencies. Don't come to the race not having put miles on your car. That's really, really stressful for you. We don't want to be working in the parking lot, which I have done. You want to have spent miles, you have put miles on your car, Make sure you know how it runs. Make sure you train your team members how to drive the car before you get here.